Hi, everybody. So this week we are talking about World War II. I do apologize for the video being a little bit late this week. Things got a little busy, and so I didn't get a chance to record it last week, but I'm going to put it up now. So today we are talking about World War II, and we really have kind of three big questions that we're going to be considering for today's lecture. And the first of these is really, why does the world go to war again in the late 1930s, and how did the U.S. become involved in the war? So that's kind of the first major topic I'm going to be talking about. And then we'll be talking about how does the war transform American society, because it makes some huge changes in American society result from World War II. So we'll be exploring some of that a little bit. And then, how does World War II set the stage for the Cold War that follows it? And that is something that we're going to be talking about next week. So what I'm going to try to do in this lecture is really kind of set the stage for why we get into a Cold War with the Soviet Union next week, and how does World War II play a role in that. So first off, why do we go to war again in the 1930s? Well, when we look at that, we have to look at the interwar period. We have to look at the period between 1920 and 1935, 36, 37 or so. And so during this period, foreign affairs is really not what you think about when people think about the 1920s and 1930s in particular. And this has resulted in kind of a general impression that America, after experiencing several decades of an expansionist foreign policy, and intervening in foreign affairs, kind of retreats back into domestic matters in the 1920s. And this is sometimes cited as one of the reasons or the kind of underlying factors that caused this breakdown in the peaceful world order in the 1930s. Some people argue that if the U.S. had maintained more of a vigilant attitude towards foreign affairs, the peace might not have collapsed. And that's an argument that there are some pros and cons to it. I'm not going to really get into too much of that here. But the 1920s was kind of an isolationist period. It was a period when America was kind of more focused upon business efforts. We had rejected the involvement in being in the League of Nations, if you remember. And many people were very adamant that the U.S. should never, ever again get involved in any kind of a foreign conflict or a foreign war. The government seemed to be more interested in promoting the domestic economy in the United States. And the U.S., along with a number of other countries, pursued disarmament after the war. And we were pretty confident that we had these natural barriers of the Atlantic and the Pacific, and this would protect us from any kind of having to get involved in any kind of foreign conflict. Now, that didn't mean that we didn't have any kind of foreign involvement in the 1920s. Of course we did. We had lots of foreign investment. And we were also bankrolling pretty much a lot of the countries in Europe, especially countries like Germany that had been devastated by World War I. Now, what happens in the 1930s with the Great Depression is that the Great Depression is kind of a worldwide phenomenon. It's something that goes all over the world, and the collapse of the U.S. economy has some very severe consequences for collapse of economies in other countries as well. And it leads to some pretty difficult consequences in terms of politics. So, for example, Germany. Germany had been getting a lot of loans from the U.S., and they had been getting those loans in order to pay back the reparations that they owed Britain and France and other European nations because of World War I. Now, when the U.S. economy collapses with the Great Depression, all of those, loans and stuff, we start calling in those loans from Germany. And this becomes a really spiraling problem because it kind of collapses the German economy as well. And this leads to, you might argue, at least in part, leads to the rise of fascist movements like Hitler and the Nazi Party. So we're going to explore a little bit of that in just a bit. So obviously during the 1930s, the U.S. was very much focused upon what was happening with the Great Depression at home. We were preoccupied with our own economic troubles, and we were trying not to worry about what was going on in the rest of the world. But as you can see from this cartoon, it starts to become increasingly clear that the storm clouds that are gathering over Europe and other places around the world are going to start affecting us at home in the United States. And here you can see Uncle Sam kind of lamenting that the Atlantic Ocean, this, sort of barrier, this natural geographic barrier between us and Europe that allowed us to kind of maintain our distance and allowed us to, kind of keep out of European affairs, that this wasn't as big of a gulf as it used to be. And some of those storm clouds were starting to threaten the U.S. as well. So we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. Now, really, the first kind of major threatening thing that comes on the horizon actually doesn't come from Europe. It comes from Japan. And it comes in the form of Japanese territorial aggression. Now, the Japanese had kind of become a dominant power in the world in the early part of the 20th century. Japan was, seen as a respected world power in the 1920s. But the fact that, sort of the problem was that the military started to becoming very dominant in Japan. Military officials started exercising their power. They started, sort of accusing the Japanese civilian government of violating the emperor's right of supreme command when they started to, disarm and do all of these and join the world community in that way. And the Japanese were very much kind of coveting, they wanted to kind of play this larger role in the world, and they were very much kind of coveting and in conflict with their larger neighbor to the west, China. And the Japanese military in China was, military authority in China was relatively independent. And they kind of wanted to take a hard line with China, more so than the Japanese civilian government did. And China at this time was kind of mired in internal squabbles with the communist movement there in China. And so they were, they were kind of, unstable internally. So the Japanese military in this area up here that you can see on the map is labeled Manchuria. There was a Japanese military presence there, and they wanted to provoke an incident with China that would allow them to invade and allow the Japanese to invade and to set up a puppet government there. So they kind of manufacture this incident by destroying a section of railroad. And they blame this on the Chinese military forces nearby. And so the Japanese use this manufactured incident as an excuse to invade Manchuria in 1931. They don't meet with very much resistance. They end up, basically winning and occupying Manchuria. They rename the country Manchukuo. And so the Chinese, they come to the United Nations, or not the United Nations, the League of Nations. They come to the League of Nations asking for help. This is exactly what the League had been set up to do, set up to basically sanction and to use sanctions against and also, sort of fight up against any kind of foreign power that encroached upon the territory of another. And so this was a big problem. So the League of Nations urge a ceasefire. They urge a cessation in fighting. They appeal to the United States for assistance. Even though the U.S. is not part of the League, it's still a major power. And the U.S. gets involved. They issue some pretty harsh words against the Japanese. And they really kind of thought that the actions of the Japanese army would be checked by the civilian leaders in Japan, and they kind of overestimate the government's ability to control the military. So the League calls for a ceasefire. The Japanese military respond by escalating the hostilities. The League sets up a commission to investigate this incident that had provoked the invasion of Manchuria, and Americans, were involved in this commission, even though they weren't part of the League. The commission eventually blamed the Japanese for this so-called crisis, and they urge a return to kind of the pre-1931 situation. In response to that, the Japanese withdraw from the League of Nations. So we have now this one country that has decided to leave the League of Nations, which is not a good sign. So from 1931 to about 1937 or so, the Chinese and the Japanese are kind of fighting these skirmishes. But in 1937, things escalate into an all-out war. This is the second Sino-Japanese War, which lasts from 1937 all the way to 1945. And some people have argued that you can really date the beginning of the Second World War not to 1939, as it usually is, sort of dated, but to 1937, when the Japanese and the Chinese start basically fighting a war against each other. The Japanese initially scored some major victories. They captured the city of Shanghai, and after the Chinese lost Shanghai, the Chinese leader, Chiang Kai-shek, he knew that the capture of Nanking, which was the capital of China at the time, was only a matter of time. So the leaders of the Chinese government decide to leave the capital. They leave the leading Chinese general in charge of the city of Nanking. They leave him with about 100,000 soldiers, most of whom were, untrained, and of course the civilians living there. And they actually prevent civilians from fleeing the city. They, sort of block all of the exits and basically, sort of preventing a widespread evacuation. So the Chinese and the Japanese, they are fighting for the city of Nanking. The Chinese greatly outnumbered the Japanese. They had plenty of ammunition, but the Chinese troops, basically, they cannot withstand the ferocity of this Japanese attack, and they retreat. And after just 4 days of fighting, Japanese troops enter the city of Nanking on December 13th, 1937. And they have orders to kill all captives. And there were a lot of Westerners actually living in the city of Nanking at the time. And so there were people, conducting trade. There were people there living on, who were missionaries. And as the Japanese army approached Nanking, most of the sort of Westerners end up fleeing the city. Only about 27 Westerners end up staying in Nanking. 5 of these were journalists, and 15 of the remaining 22 form a committee called the International Committee for the Nanking Safety Zone in the western quarter of the city. And so there are all these eyewitness accounts of both Westerners and Chinese people present at Nanking, and the show the Japanese army just rampaging through the city, engaging in rape, murder, theft, arson, all kinds of just horrific war crimes. And so the accounts of these start coming back to the West, and people are just horrified at what's gone on in Nanking. So this is really kind of the first example of this kind of aggressive, militaristic push by some of these nations. Japan is kind of the one who starts it, and you can see this picture here of a Japanese soldier holding the severed head of someone he has just killed. And this is, pictures like this started to come out, sort of a big issue. So a lot of threatening things going on in Europe as well. We've got Italy. What's going on with Italy? So Italy was now being run by Mussolini, who was a fascist dictator, and he wants to restore the Italian Empire over the Mediterranean. The Italian colonies of their own, and they felt they kind of got the short end of the stick after World War I. Now, Ethiopia, whom you can see here on the map, this was one of the few African countries that had not yet been colonized. And this was a really attractive place for the Italians because it would unify these 2 other colonies which the Italians were holding at the time. Eritrea up here, which is down here on the coast of the Horn of Africa here. So Ethiopia was considered to be, kind of militarily weak, but it was rich in resources. And they had actually fought against, the Ethiopians had previously suppressed their independence. So the Italians began building up troops along the border between Ethiopia and Somaliland in 1930. They established an outpost within Ethiopian territory, and the Ethiopians are protesting this. And the League of Nations is trying to appease both sides. And then on October 3rd, 1935, the Italians attack, both from the north here in Eritrea and from the south in Somaliland. So they invade Ethiopia. And the League of Nations imposes an embargo upon Italy as a result of this, but it's largely ineffective because it does not cover things like oil, which was obviously a vital material. Italy ends up, overrunning the country of Ethiopia, but to May of 1936, Italy is annexed Ethiopia. On June 30th, 1936, the Emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, he is in exile at this point, and he gives a speech before the League of Nations denouncing Italy's actions. He criticizes the world community for standing by for, hey, it's us today, it's going to be you tomorrow. And as a result of the League's condemnation of Italy for invading Ethiopia, Mussolini declares that Italy is going to withdraw from the League of Nations. Now, we have two nations who have withdrawn their support and participation from the League of Nations. And Germany has also withdrawn at this point. When Hitler comes to power in 1933, Germany withdraws. So that makes three very powerful countries who have abandoned this idea of international cooperation and who are pursuing their own expansionist agenda. So the question is, well, why do the other nations of the League, why are they willing to sit by and see these countries abandon it? And whether the presence of the United States might have made a difference here, it's hard to say, but it's definitely an interesting question to ask. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about Germany, because obviously the most disturbing of all of these international developments was what was happening in Germany. A democratic republic set up in Germany called the Weimar Republic, but this regime was very unstable, both politically and economically. They constantly had economic problems. And Germany, as I mentioned, was particularly affected by the Great Depression because they'd relied so heavily on American loans to be able to make those reparation payments. The government ends up financing its deficit by printing more money, which is never a good idea. It leads to hyperinflation. And in addition to the economic difficulties, there's a lot of bitterness left in the country after World War I. Germans felt they had been betrayed during the war. Many Germans believed that they hadn't really lost World War I militarily, but they had instead been stabbed in the back by war profiteers and corrupt officials who were essentially traitors, who essentially abandoned their allegiance to Germany and made peace. And so this belief was also linked with a growing nationalism and also very rampant anti-Semitism. So anyone seen as not truly German was suspected of having betrayed the country, and Jews were the favorite target of this. The National Socialists, or the Nazis for short, they capitalize on all of this bitterness and this economic instability to start gaining increasing amounts of political power in the late 1920s and 1930s. Nazism is usually considered to be a particular type of fascism. It's that type of fascism that combines a nationalistic, kind of centrist, militaristic aspects of a fascist state with this very distinct racial ideology. So according to Nazism, Nazi ideology, you simply could not have different cultures living together within a nation. Fundamental to the Nazis' goal was the unification of all Germanic people. And the idea was that they had been unjustly divided into different nations, and so it was necessary to kind of unify all Germanic peoples together. So Hitler claimed that nations who couldn't defend their territory shouldn't deserve to keep it. And he thought of, sort of this whole racial hierarchy where there were the master races and the slave races. And the slave races were less worthy to exist than the master races. And in particular, if a master race, a so-called master race, should require room to live, or LEBENSRAUM, he thought such a race should have the right to displace those inferior races. So this is Nazi ideology, and how this drives foreign policy, we're going to see. So in the early 1930s, the Nazis begin increasing their presence within the German parliament. They start winning elections. The German parliament was also known as the Reichstag. Hitler was appointed chancellor by President Hindenburg on January 30th, 1933. And then on February 27th, the building housing the Reichstag was set on fire. And the circumstances were very suspicious as communist groups within the country. And then after the fire, they end up winning 43% of the seats in the Reichstag. And because they're able to do this, they are able to push through what's known as the Enabling Act. And the Enabling Act essentially allows the chancellor and his cabinet to enact legislation without having to go through the parliament. So effectively, the parliament is giving away all of its power to make laws. to the chancellor. And they also can make changes to the German constitution as well, which is, sort of a huge abdication of power. After further suppression of opposition, they ban, other political parties. They assassinate opposition leaders. The Nazis finally assume dictatorial power. Hitler, after the death of President Hindenburg in August of 1934, Hitler is now in complete control of the country. So the Nazis spend most of the 1930s rebuilding Germany's economic and military power. And the rest of the world starts to hear, sort of little trickles of, disturbing and suspicious things going on in Germany, but most people aren't paying much attention to what Germany is up to until Hitler starts to make his move to expand Germany's Lebensraum. So in 1936, Germany moves to occupy the Rhineland, which is a strip of territory between Germany and France. And you can see that on this small map down here. This is the Rhineland. And this was an area that had traditionally been fought over a lot between Germany and France. They've been fighting over this region of the country for centuries. And so, even though this was in violation of a lot of different treaties, Britain and France basically ignore it. They say, well, this is, sort of a traditionally kind of Germanic region, and so we're not going to, sort of really begrudge them the occupation of this area. 2 years later, in 1938, Germany annexes Austria. Austria is down here in the kind of purple area down here. So Germany now is annexed Austria. And this is known as the Anschluss. And again, other nations don't do much other than just kind of say, well, we wish you hadn't done that. That's not so great. And Germany is kind of at this point seen as reoccupying areas that are already heavily ethnically German. And so Hitler then moves to occupy this area in yellow over here, the Sudetenland, which was part of Czechoslovakia at the time. But it was a region that was also ethnically German. And so throughout all of this, other nations in Europe are practicing this policy of appeasement, figuring if they give the Germans what they wanted, it would prevent conflict from erupting. And you have to consider the mindset of the English and the French at this point. They had fought this incredibly devastating war just a few years earlier against Germany, and it had been catastrophic in terms of the demographic havoc that it wreaked upon their populations. An entire generation of young men is wiped out in World War I. They do not want to go through this again. And so they are trying to do everything they can to prevent war from happening again. And so this is really what's behind the policy of appeasement. And I think if we look back on it, it seems like hindsight, well, you can look back and say, how could you have not known what Hitler was up to? How could you have, sort of let it go so far? But if we think about, sort of where the mindset was at the time, it's kind of understandable. They wanted to prevent war. And they had, seen what a devastating world war could do. And they wanted at all costs to try to prevent that from happening again. So they figure if they just, sort of allow a little bit of expansion, that this is going to, sort of prevent an all-out conflict from breaking out. Now, in 1939, the Soviet Union signs a non-aggression pact with Hitler. And immediately thereafter, Hitler invades Poland on September 1st, 1939. And this prompts Britain and France to finally declare war against Germany. Poland is a bridge too far, and the Nazis begin fighting this incredibly devastating blitzkrieg lightning war, overrunning Poland, overrunning Scandinavia, Belgium, the Netherlands, and finally France. So now, effectively, by 1940, Britain is fighting alone, fighting Germany for 1 year, while many people in the U.S. are still kind of reluctant to come to their aid. And there's still a great deal of opposition to American involvement. There was a whole organization known as the America First Committee with very famous members like Henry Ford, Father Charles Coughlin, who we talked about when we talked about the New Deal. Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator, was a big supporter of this America First Committee. And the America First Committee was, at least in part, it was, sort of some of the members really argued, well, we just do not want to get involved in these kind of foreign wars again. Some of it was, kind of that old school isolationism. Some of it, though, was sympathy for the Nazis. And in particular, people like Charles Lindbergh, Henry Ford, they kind of admired what Hitler had done in Germany. They admired his, sort of ability to kind of rebuild his country's economy. They admired, sort of the efficiency of the German industrial economy. And so they thought that this was kind of a good thing and something to, maybe emulate. And there was a fair amount of anti-Semitism that also inspired them. So this America First Committee argued that we should not be getting involved in the war. And after they had some, sort of a considerable amount of influence on the debate, but after a very long debate, Congress agrees to authorize the sale of arms to Britain on a so-called cash and carry basis. So all of these weapons, if you wanted to buy weapons from the United States, they had to be paid for in cash and they had to be transported in British ships. In 1940, Roosevelt ran and was reelected for an unprecedented third term. And as the war was raging on in Europe, the U.S. is becoming more and more closely allied with those who are fighting Germany and also fighting in Japan. So we start to, support the Chinese as well. FDR declares that America is going to be the great arsenal of democracy. And in 1941, Congress passes the Lend-Lease Act, which authorizes the U.S. to give military aid as long as countries promise to return it after the war. So basically, we're giving them loans, and then we expect to be paid back. The U.S. also begins funneling billions of dollars worth of arms to Britain and also to China. Now, when Hitler reannounces the Non-Aggression Pact and invades the Soviet Union on June of 1941, we also start lending arms to the Russians as well. FDR ends up freezing Japanese assets in the United States. There's all trade between the U.S. and Japan is halted, including the sale of oil. And of course, Japan, as an island nation, really needs oil. And so it's this embargo that is one of the main reasons that Japan starts to move in an aggressive posture toward the United States. And of course, this is what eventually ends up drawing us into the war. Now, before we even enter the war, Roosevelt already is coming up with a vision for the post-war world. And he articulates this vision in his 1941 State of the Union address, which is given early in 1941. And this is better remembered as the Four Freedoms speech. The address is almost entirely devoted to this growing international conflict. And it's really the last 4 minutes of the speech that is the most kind of, important and remembered part. And this is where he outlines what he calls the four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And you can see here on the left, later in 1943, the artist Norman Rockwell, he depicts these four freedoms in a series of famous paintings. And these paintings were very popular. They were designed to boost American morale on the home front. And they were, brought out basically to sell things like war bonds and to promote the war effort. Now you can see on the right here, this is a copy of the actual speech. And you can see Roosevelt's made some edits here to it. He's written the words "everywhere in the world" after each of his four freedoms. And I think this is very, very telling because Roosevelt is trying to communicate here that the four freedoms aren't simply the reasons America is fighting for itself. These aren't just the things that we want to preserve in our own country. We are fighting for the four freedoms for the entire world. This is a really bold statement that FDR is making here. He is laying claim to post-war American supremacy in the international situation. He is saying we are going to be the leader of the world and we are going to fight to give the entire world these freedoms which we here enjoy in America. So before the U.S. even enters the war, FDR is starting to think about what this post-war world is going to look like. And he continues to think about it. And he continues to plan for the peace with the leader of Great Britain, Winston Churchill. Roosevelt and Churchill meet in secret under heavy security in August of 1941. So again, this is before the U.S. gets into the war. They're meeting together off the coast of Canada. And they come up for a vision of the post-war world in a document that's known as the Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter is signed by a number of governments who are fighting the Nazis, and it's basically World War II's version of the 14 points. It contains a lot of the same principles. We explicitly say we are not fighting this war for territorial gain, that any kind of drawing of new national boundaries had to be democratic. We call for things like self-determination. We call for free trade, disarmament. And the Atlantic Charter also talks about things like improving labor standards, economic advancement around the world. And the freedom from want and freedom from fear are part of the Atlantic Charter. They are actually written into the Atlantic Charter. And of course, the other two are freedom of speech and freedom of religion. Roosevelt reiterates all of these principles again in a speech that he gives before Congress later in August after he's come back from this conference. And he says, "It's unnecessary for me to point out that the Declaration of Principles includes of necessity the world need for freedom of religion and freedom of information. No society of a world organized under the announced principles could survive without these freedoms, which are part of the whole freedom for which we strive." So he says basically that the four freedoms are going to be, part of this Atlantic Charter. They are part of the official war aims of the Allied nations. And again, this is, sort of laying a pretty bold claim towards American supremacy. So how do we eventually get drawn into the war? Well, of course, on December 7th, 1941, Japanese planes attack the naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. It's the first attack by a foreign power on American soil since the War of 1812. It's a surprise attack. It's pretty devastating. More than 2,000 American servicemen are killed. 187 aircraft, 18 ships, including 8 battleships, are destroyed or damaged. The U.S. had attacked Japan had attacked the United States, and this really kind of solves Roosevelt's dilemma of how to get America involved in World War II without risking alienating those who are still kind of isolationist or on the fence. After Pearl Harbor, nearly everybody is in favor of fighting. We have to go to war at this point. So that brings us to, how does the war change America? Now, probably the biggest single effect of the U.S. entering World War II is that the war ends the Great Depression. Prior to the U.S. entering the war, the economy had been pretty stagnant, and you can see that in this chart of unemployment. All the way up to 1940, unemployment never falls below 15%. But even before the U.S. enters the war officially, it begins to fall because American industry is ramping up in preparation for our official entry into the war. And by 1942, now that America is officially fighting, we are back to pre-Depression era levels of unemployment. And you can really see that in this photo here, which shows a chalkboard outside a factory that is listing all the jobs that they need to fill. And this is a pretty stark contrast to what we saw in the Great Depression, right? As you might imagine, this was a very welcome relief to all the workers who were still unemployed. Now, there were more jobs than anybody could do. And there were, jobs everywhere you looked. What were all these new jobs like? Well, for the most part, these new jobs are located in factories that had been reorganized to produce weapons, vehicles, aircraft, other things for the war effort. And this is a picture of a factory assembly line producing tanks. Before the war, this plant probably produced Cadillacs. So these wartime industries were remarkably efficient. By 1944, American factories could produce a ship every single day and an airplane every 5 minutes. So it was this huge amount of war material being churned out by these American factories that really makes a huge difference in the war effort. The number of government jobs also rises because there's all these new wartime agencies that are set up in order to fight the war. The number of federal workers rises from 1 million to 4 million. And a lot of these new agencies are designed to regulate the economy. during the war. During the New Deal, the federal government had, of course, gotten involved in regulating the economy, and this process continues and expands during the war. The relationship between government and business also changes. During the New Deal, the Roosevelt administration and big business had often been kind of at loggerheads. They'd been at odds. But now both sides realize they kind of want to work together for their mutual benefit. So FDR offers incentives to businesses to increase production. He gives them loans, tax breaks, guaranteed contracts. There's all this new scientific research and technological research that gets sponsored because of the war. And it helps to develop new technologies that not only help to win the war, but also are going to transform American life after the war. And labor unions also benefit from the war, as we can see in this table. Union membership was up to nearly 15 million Americans by the end of the war, and this is the highest proportion of the total workforce in American history. And during the war, labor unions work with both business and the federal government to win recognition for themselves. So this is a huge increase in kind of the power of labor unions as well. So we go from depression to really economic boom during the war. And World War II also changes America in a physical way. And you can see that in this map. It shows how American society during the war really becomes militarized. The red dots on the map are airfields, bases, and air stations. The green dots are army camps, forts, and posts. And the blue dots, as you can see along the coast, those are naval stations. And you can see how military activity is very heavily concentrated along the west coast over here and also along in the south. There's a huge concentration here. Not so much in kind of the mountain states of the Midwest and also the northern Midwest. There isn't too much of a presence up here, but almost every region and state of the country is affected in some way by the war. And a lot of these bases and forts are going to remain after the war. So this is kind of, you can see sort of the physical changes that go on in American society because of World War II. One of the big changes that comes about because of the war are women, is the changes in the lives of women. Women, whether the war changes ideas about gender, is a kind of a big debate among historians. The war definitely changes the economic circumstances of many American women, and this may have led to changing attitudes about women's role in society as well. So to fill the jobs that were being vacated by men who were going overseas to serve, for the first time you see the governments, you see Hollywood films, the media, big business, really encouraging women to go to work outside the home, to become independent and self-sufficient, and to form kind of this domestic army of Rosie the Riveters. And you can see these ads. One of the things that I think we can really notice in these ads is that they are kind of trying to glorify and glamorize the roles of working women. And they kind of suggest that even though you're working outside the home and you're working in kind of these factory jobs, which, you know, had traditionally been held by men, you don't have to sacrifice your femininity. You know, they're portraying these women as, you know, very attractive, young, you know, sort of very happy to do their duty. And they're, you know, resolved to do their part to win the war. A lot of women are still working, of course, in kind of traditionally feminine positions, like clerical or service jobs. But there are some newer opportunities for women in industrial positions, in professional positions, and in government. And for the first time in history, you see married women begin to outnumber single women in the workforce. And women are able to kind of, you know, use this leverage that they have now during the war to confront issues like childcare, like maternity leave, like equal pay. And so they're able to force unions to kind of, you know, push for those sort of things. Women also serve in the military during the war, the Women's Army Corps, and the Women's Naval Reserves, the WAVES. And about 150,000 American women serve in the Women's Army Corps during World War II. About 350,000 women all total serve in the military. And most of them were in kind of, you know, they weren't on the front lines necessarily, but they were, you know, manning military posts at home. They were, you know, working in, you know, behind the scenes on, you know, sort of in the working, sort of away from the front lines. So a lot of them, sort of were put into harm's way as well. So we have some concrete changes, definitely, during World War II in the roles of women, but it's not clear whether these changes are going to be lasting. And one of the things that you notice about these posters is that they all depict women's work as solely part of the war effort. Victory waits on your fingers. Get a war job. The more women at work, the sooner we will win. All of these imply that women working is a temporary emergency measure. None of them talk about work as something that might benefit women themselves. And now if you look at these posters, these are also from World War II, you can see that ideas about gender roles in the family aren't really changing all that much. The ideal is still kind of the family-centered prosperity. Husbands going out to work, wives greeting them when they come home, a man's home is his castle, the family is a sacred institution. And the assumption is that once the war is over, things are going to return to so-called normal, and the men are going to return home to their wives and their children, and everything's going to go back to the way it was. And to a large extent, this is what happened. When the war was over, most female war workers, particularly those working in those industrial jobs, were fired, and they went back home. So societal attitudes about gender roles might not have changed too much because of the war, but the door had been opened for these women. And it was tough to kind of shut it entirely. If you were a woman during World War II, if you'd enjoyed the fulfillment and the economic independence that having a job brought, it would have been hard to miss that once the war was over. So we don't see a lot of real immediate change coming out of the war, but the seeds of change are sown, and those seeds are going to eventually bring forth a new feminist movement once we get to the 1960s. World War II also kind of complicates and changes the way Americans think about the issues of race. The U.S. is, of course, fighting against an enemy whose basic ideology of a master race triumphing over and subduing all other people seems to be totally at odds, totally abhorrent to American values. And the war kind of really brings to the forefront this pluralistic vision of an American society that celebrates diversity and that guarantees, at least in theory, equality for everybody, regardless of race or national origin or religion. During World War I, the wartime ideology had kind of been this forced assimilation, and you had to be patriotic, you had to be American, and it was particularly inflicted upon Americans of different European ethnicities. And this is partly due to kind of the pre-existing nativism that happened, and also fears that, sort of new immigrants would flood into the country, that they couldn't be assimilated, they might bring in foreign ideas. We don't see that in World War II. The mobilization of the home front for the war effort causes a lot of population movement around the country. People are moving all over the place. And millions of Americans are moving out of their previously ethnically homogenous neighborhoods, and they go into the army, they go to war industries, and either way they come into contact with people from all different walks of life, all different ethnicities. And this helps to kind of foster a sort of patriotic assimilation. You can really see that in Hollywood films of the time, which if you've ever watched, war films about World War II from, sort of the 1940s and 1950s, 1960s, you can see like how they always have in there, you'll have a unit of soldiers, and they'll always have like soldiers from all different places. So you'll have, sort of the Italian guy from Brooklyn. You'll have the Jewish guy from New Jersey. You'll have, sort of the Scandinavian guy from, sort of the Midwest. You'll have, people from all different places kind of coming together and representing kind of, America as this great diverse place. So diversity is now something that's kind of being celebrated during the war. Now, this is obviously a rewriting of American history. It's glossing over centuries of American, when American identity is deeply tied to racial or ethnic status. But it's also reflecting kind of changes in scientific beliefs. By the 1940s, scientists are coming to understand that, they're coming to understand how genetics works a little bit better. And it's becoming clear that biologically, race doesn't really mean that much. So all of those old kind of pseudo-scientific ideas about race are becoming discredited and debunked. And they're, rejecting the idea that you can link race or culture with intelligence. So racism and nativism are kind of losing a lot of their intellectual respectability. Now, this does not mean that all Americans kind of suddenly become tolerant in the face of Hitler's threat. There's still a lot of bigotry, a lot of intolerance that exists, even for some ethnic groups that we today would consider to be white. For example, Jews still faced considerable anti-Semitism in America during the 1940s, and this would continue after the war was over. And for non-white groups, the war doesn't really change all that much, as we're going to see. I think you can see this kind of reflected in this cartoon on the right here, where you have, Lady Liberty is greeting all of her children. She's welcoming them into her arms, and you see they're from, Polish descent and German descent and Italian and French and Irish and British. They're all being welcomed in. But these are all from ethnic groups that we would consider to be white. They have European ancestry. But what does this say about non-whites? Well, we're going to explore that. Probably no single ethnic group in America experienced more of the intolerance that really still plagues the nation during World War II than Japanese Americans. The war against Japan is intensely personal for Americans in a way that the war against Germany really just wasn't. The Japanese had attacked the U.S. directly. Many Americans feel kind of this intense hatred and need for revenge against the Japanese. And there's this long-standing prejudice against Asians that also feeds into the mix here, particularly on the West Coast. An editorial in Life magazine in May of 1945 explained it this way. It said, "Americans had to learn to hate the Germans, but hating Japs comes natural as fighting Indian wars once was." So you can see in that quote just how, kind of racially charged the war had become. And it was a racially charged war on both sides of the Pacific. If you look at Japanese propaganda from the time, it shows Americans as being kind of lazy and self-indulgent. And the fact that the U.S. has all this ethnic and racial diversity, the Japanese argued that this would make us weaker against the so-called racially pure Japanese. American propaganda, if you look at American propaganda of the time, it portrays the Japanese as subhuman. And you can really see that in this cover here from a popular magazine of the time. So a lot of propagandists are likening the Japanese to animals like snakes and rats. And as you can see here, you've got a vampire bat. And obviously this is key to undercutting the humanity of your enemy, right? The enemy is less than human, therefore it's much easier to kill them. And so we see this kind of racism really, implied in the cartoons, in the drawings, in the artwork of the time. But you can also see it has really devastating, real-world consequences for Japanese Americans, particularly for the thousands who are living on the West Coast when the war is declared. Most Japanese Americans were living in California at the time, and most of them were second generation. They had been born in America. They were citizens. And many of them spoke very little Japanese, maybe no Japanese at all. They'd never been to Japan, but they become instantly suspect from the minute America enters the war. And there's this long history of anti-Asian sentiment on the West Coast that comes into play here. And war with Japan kind of reawakens all those old feelings of suspicion. So you see newspaper headlines, columnists begin to warn about saboteurs and fifth column activity, and politicians jump on this anti-Japanese bandwagon. They begin spouting all these warnings of imminent danger from Japanese Americans. Now, Congress looked into this, and they issued a report. A congressional committee was set up to to look into the issue, and they argue that, most Japanese are loyal. Most Japanese Americans were not, sort of involved in any kind of espionage activity or anything like that. But there's this mounting public hysteria. There's this reaction from the military. The military is freaking out. And this all culminates in Executive Order 9066, which Roosevelt issues in February of 1942. And it mandates the expulsion of all persons of Japanese descent from the West Coast. So in the spring of 1942, just a few months after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, more than 100,000 residents of Japanese ancestry were forcefully evicted from their homes in Washington, Oregon, California, Arizona, and Alaska. And they are sent to these nearby temporary assembly centers. And from there, they are sent by train to American-style concentration camps at remote inland sites where many people spent the remainder of the war. And you can see on this map here where some of these camps were located. Most of them were kind of in the mountain, states in the west. Some of them were as far east as Arkansas. Many families wound up spending 3 years in these kind of facilities. Most lost, or they sold their homes. They had to sell them, very quickly. They had to close down their businesses. Many were unable to kind of, recoup those losses after the war. And these relocation centers were set up to be self-sufficient. They had kind of their own hospitals, the post offices, schools, but everything is surrounded by barbed wire. There were guard towers dotting the scene. The guards are living separately from the Japanese Americans. The apartments were small and cramped. They were often built of subpar materials, very shoddy workmanship because they'd been constructed so hastily. And the camps were very often, in pretty remote places, and they, were subject to some pretty extreme weather conditions. And the internees of these camps, they were put through this sort of quasi-military discipline. They had to wake up every morning for roll call. They had to eat in these mess halls. You couldn't eat together as a family. They tried to do their best to make things more home-like, but this internment really had a devastating effect upon families and Japanese American families who were interned there. So it's really a tragic era or a tragic incident in American history, and it's only just now, kind of becoming in the 1980s, 1990s into the 2000s, it's starting to be recognized as really a huge kind of blot upon American history. To an even greater extent, we see World War II affecting the African American community as well. The war continues and it strengthens the movement of African Americans from the South into the North and the West. Hundreds of thousands of African Americans leave the South during the years of the war. They're looking for jobs. They're looking to escape the racism of Southern society. But they also encounter a lot of racial hostility in the North and the West as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit about an example of this. Many African Americans from the South come to the city of Detroit. They are lured by the promise of jobs in this city, and it's known as the arsenal of democracy because, of course, before the war it had been the center of the automobile industry. Now, during the war, it's where all the tanks and ships and airplanes are being made. Detroit has a very long and troubled history of race relations, and the city was not very well equipped to handle the thousands of new people who are coming. And it had also become a stronghold of the revived KKK in the 1920s. So there's this kind of simmering racial tension that exists there already. The industrial plants that had been set up to, produce all this war effort, they provided people with jobs, but they didn't do anything about housing. And so as a result, the 200,000 African Americans who are living in the city become cramped into this, basically 60 square blocks, and they're forced to live under these pretty deplorable conditions. Ironically enough, this neighborhood was called Paradise Valley. So there's all this simmering tension, and this comes to a head in June of 1943. And basically what happens is a riot ends up breaking out. And you have, thousands of white residents, fighting with the city's black residents. The police are trying to kind of retain the situation, but the rioting spreads into the city of Detroit. And eventually, the mayor of Detroit has to call in federal troops. More than 6,000 federal troops had to be strategically stationed throughout the city to put down this riot that happens in Detroit. And Detroit is basically under armed occupation at this point. By the end of the rioting, which lasted for several days, 25 black residents and 9 white residents have been killed. Of the 25 African Americans, 17 had been killed by the police. The number who were injured approached 700, while property damage amounted to about $2 million. So this is just one example of the kind of racial tension that was brought about by all of this, sort of movement of people into, kind of these centers for war production. You see this all around the country, not just in Detroit, but in other places as well, in the South, in the West. You see this kind of, simmering racial tension exploding into violence. And it's not something that's very often talked about in American history, but we think of, World War II as being this time when Americans were, all united and patriotic behind the war effort, and everybody was fighting to, sort of win the war. But it's also this time when you see a lot of racial tension and violence happening in the country. And what we see kind of emerging out of the experience of African Americans in the war is really the modern civil rights movement. One of the first manifestations of this comes before the U.S. is even officially fighting. In the spring of 1941, the black labor leader, A. Philip Randolph, he calls for a march on Washington to protest racial discrimination by the federal government. And he kind of, wants to stage this dramatic public event to convince the president to ensure economic opportunity in the defense industries and in government agencies. And he says, sort of, if American democracy will not defend its defenders, if American democracy will not protect its protectors, if American democracy will not give jobs to toilers because of race or color, if American democracy will not ensure equality of opportunity, it is a hollow mockery and belies the principles for which it is supposed to stand. So now, obviously, this would not look very good, and Roosevelt's plan, or Randolph's plan, scare the Roosevelt administration enough for FDR to issue Executive Order 8802, which bans discrimination in defense jobs, and it establishes the Fair Employment Practices Commission. This commission doesn't have a lot of enforcement power, but it holds hearings that expose kind of the patterns of racial discrimination in hiring practices. And so it's really the first kind of federal agency since the period of Reconstruction to be actively working for equal opportunity for African Americans. So it is kind of a major step forward. During the war, you see membership in the NAACP growing. New organizations like the Congress of Racial Equality are established. And gradually, African Americans begin to embrace the concept of the double V, which meant that victory over Germany and Japan has to be coupled with victory over segregation and racism at home. And one really interesting thing that comes out of the war is kind of a strengthened sense of Black internationalism, an identification and solidarity with all non-white people throughout the world. This idea had started all the way back in the 19th century, but it really begins to take off during World War II. There's this kind of new consciousness, particularly among African American intellectuals, that what they really should be fighting against was colonialism and racism worldwide. And you're going to see this, kind of continue after the war into the 1950s and 1960s. You see kind of, this idea of fighting on behalf of all people of color throughout the entire world against things like colonialism and racism. All right, so that kind of brings us to the last big question. How does World War II lead us to the Cold War? And as I see it, there are kind of three major wartime diplomacy issues that lead the U.S. and the Soviet Union into a Cold War. There's the major question of how to fight the war, specifically the issue of establishing a second front in Europe. And this leads to a lot of tension between the U.S. and Britain and the Soviet Union. It becomes a major bone of contention for the Allies during the war. We also have the establishment of post-war aims. And there are fundamental differences between the way the U.S. wants to see the world after the war and the way the Soviet Union sees the post-war international system. And finally, you have the big dilemma presented by the atomic bomb. The major questions here are, how are we going to use the bomb, if it would be used at all, and who do we tell about it? Specifically, do we inform the Soviets? And in my view, this is really kind of the primary issue that leads us into a Cold War with Russia. And that's one of the reasons why I made this the topic of our discussion for this week, because I think it's a really interesting and thorny question. So the issue of how to fight the war. A lot of the conflict over how to fight the war had to do with the kind of relationship that existed between the U.S. and Britain, between Britain and the Soviet Union, between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. This is not a particularly easy partnership. Now, the alliance between the U.S. and Britain is very, very strong. We had this personal friendship between Churchill and Roosevelt. We had some common strategy, common goals. There was a, Anglo-American military operations going on. It was a very close relationship. The Soviets are kind of left out. They're sort of the third wheel. Before the alliance with the Soviet Union was formed, Americans and the British, they see this non-aggression pact that Hitler and Stalin had signed in August of 1939. They see this as evidence that fascism and communism are basically just two sides of the same coin. They're essentially too similar. And even after the Germans invade the Soviet Union in 1941, the US and Britain are still afraid that Hitler and Stalin are going to, again, come to terms at some point. And the Soviets are also afraid of this. They're afraid of the possibility of the British and the US making a separate peace with Germany. There's this long-standing history of anti-communism in America. There are these deep cultural and ideological differences, and so this makes wartime cooperation between these three powers pretty difficult. Now, the Soviets are fighting this incredibly desperate and debilitating battle against the Germans. They are fighting on the Eastern Front, and they want the Allies to invade Europe to relieve some of the burden of fighting the war. And this pressure only intensifies as the war goes on. Roosevelt keeps promising that this invasion is coming soon, and Stalin keeps pressuring FDR and Churchill to set a definite date for it. Now, the Americans and the British, they assure Stalin that the Second Front is coming, but they can't agree amongst themselves on where and when to invade. The Americans say, we want to go in now. We want to go in through Northern Europe now. But the British are saying, no, we're not ready yet. We want to go in through Southern Europe. We want to start in North Africa. We want to, invade through Italy. And Americans eventually agree that the Allies weren't prepared yet to invade Northern Europe, so they opt for the British plan. They opt for, sort of starting in North Africa and then going up into Italy. And so there's all this delay going on, and the Americans are, saying, well, government officials they're repeatedly acknowledging the Soviets' need for, us to get involved and us to, help take some of the pressure off, but they don't seem very persuaded to speed up preparations for the establishment of a second front. So the first time that Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin actually meet together in the war is at the Tehran Conference in November of 1943. So this is pretty far into the war before any of these three major powers are actually meeting and talking. And the chief issue here is, when are we going to start this second front? Roosevelt finally sets a timetable. He says, we're going to invade in the spring of 1944. This is going to happen. Stalin is kind of appeased at this. And he seems to be kind of satisfied with, so that the Allies, after they demonstrated kind of that they were willing to meet the Soviets halfway. And the issue of the Second Front is basically resolved in 1943. And after that, relations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union are kind of on a little bit better terms. But this doesn't get us off on a good foot, right? All the stalling on this issue doesn't do much to get things off to a good start. And so there's this uneasy partnership that's going to continue throughout the war. Now, part of this unease has to do with the fact that we don't really agree on what we want to see for the post-war world. The U.S., of course, wants to avert the possibility of another economic depression. And it really sees the expansion of free trade as the answer. The American economy is, of course, growing enormously during the war. The U.S. is in the most advantageous position to compete for economic dominance. And economic cooperation, kind of free trade and, sort of establishing some kind of international economic system is going to stabilize the political system as well. And so what the U.S. is arguing for is kind of, we want to avert another depression. We want to secure post-war dominance in international economic matters. So in July of 1944, the U.S. convenes an international conference at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. And the aim of this is to establish the international economic order for the post-war world. So what happens at the conference is that they set up two important agencies. The International Monetary Fund, this was designed to kind of stabilize currencies throughout the world, and then they also established the World Bank that's supposed to help less developed, less industrialized nations transform their economies after the war. So this is a major step taken by the U.S. to ensure this idea of an open marketplace, free trade throughout the world. And we see this kind of reflected in what comes out of the Bretton Woods Conference. And of course, Americans are going to contribute the most of the capital for setting up the IMF and the World Bank. And so this means that Americans get to control both institutions. European nations pretty much kind of have to accept American economic dominance at this point. Now, so the U.S. wants this worldwide open marketplace, especially in Europe. The Soviet Union, though, has other ideas. Stalin is really just interested in controlling large areas of Eastern Europe. He wants to control this area both as kind of a buffer zone against the West, and also for economic reasons, because there's, a lot of resources and a lot of, factories and industry in this region, so that he wants to use that for the Soviet Union. And we see this, the two different aims. So we have, on the one hand, kind of economic cooperation, free trade, everything on the side of the Americans. On the side of the Soviets, it's spheres of influence. It's controlling, Eastern Europe. And this is kind of, what his real aim was. And so the clash between American and Soviet visions for the post-war world is going to have definite political consequences, both during and after the war. Now, the question of what the post-war world is going to look like hadn't yet been decided in late 1944, even into early 1945. It's not clear what this post-war world is going to look like, even as we're getting really close to defeating the Germans. In the fall of 1944, Churchill and Stalin had met together separately from Roosevelt, and they had actually come to an agreement about who would control the nations of Europe. And Churchill agreed to allow Soviets to retain their domination over Romania and Bulgaria. In return, Britain would control Greece, and other countries would be controlled jointly. This is exactly the sort of thing that Roosevelt had wanted to avoid, and he's very shocked to learn that Churchill and Stalin had made this kind of separate deal. So they all get together in February of 1945 at the Yalta Conference, and they're together here to really hammer out what the post-war world is going to look like. The British are really interested in kind of maintaining the vestiges of their empire here. The Soviets want to ensure control over Eastern Europe. The Americans, they want to make sure that the Soviets get in on the war with Japan. They want to make sure that the Soviets are participating in the United Nations, which is being set up at this time. And Roosevelt at this time is in rapidly failing health. You can kind of see that in this picture here. He is not looking too good. So one major issue that's dealt with at the conference is the future of Poland. Poland was kind of interesting in the sense that there was this Polish government in exile in Britain. There was a democratic government, and the U.S. and the British wanted to see that Polish government in exile, reinstated after the war. The Soviets wanted something else. They wanted a friendly communist government to be put into place. And so they work out a compromise. So essentially you have these kind of dual governments here, two governments of Poland, which one is going to emerge on top. They work out a compromise in which they accept that, okay, well, initially we'll have this pro-Soviet government set up in Poland, and then eventually we'll reorganize Poland on a broader democratic basis. At this point, the Soviet Red Army is occupying most of Eastern Europe, and so there's not much that Roosevelt can really do to block Soviet expansion or control over these areas. At Yalta, they also agreed to divide Germany up into 4 zones of occupation. Each zone would be controlled by a different power. So you had an American zone, a British zone, a French zone, and a Soviet zone. And this is going to become very important in the early years of the Cold War. It's going to set us up for a lot of the conflicts of the early Cold War. Roosevelt is able to get the Soviets to agree to participate in the United Nations, but he has to agree to allow veto power to each member of the Security Council, which is the main kind of governing body of the UN. And this is going to significantly weaken the organization because, if the Soviets can come in and just veto anything, then, the UN is not going to have a lot of power at this point. So Yalta basically sets the political boundaries for the post-war world, and it establishes some of the issues that are going to prove to be crucial in the early years of the Cold War. You've got Germany, what happens with Eastern Europe, the UN. All of these things are going to kind of play a role in the Cold War, as we're going to see. So we have this uneasy reconciliation between Soviet and American post-war aims, but the stage for the Cold War conflict is really being set. So this now brings us to the issue of the atomic bomb. So how do we get to the establishment of the Manhattan Project? Well, so in the 1930s, in 1938, a couple of German physicists, Otto Hahn and Lise Meitner, they are able to achieve, the first ones to able to achieve nuclear fission with the heavy element uranium. They're able to split the atom. And they're the first able to do this. And the possibility that you could take the energy of an atom and convert it into a weapon, this was something that people had talked about and thought about for many years, but it was never really considered to be actually possible before this. And so the possibility that you could split the atom, release these particles, that those particles would then collide with other atoms, and cause those atoms to split and create this chain reaction, that this had obvious implications. And so you've got the Germans working on this. Science is colliding with the political situation in Europe. Many of the world's most eminent nuclear physicists are Jewish, and many of them had worked in Germany prior to the Nazis coming to power. But when the Nazis came to power, they were forced to flee to Britain and the US. So you've got all of these very eminent nuclear physicists, many of whom were Jewish, living now in the US and Britain. And when it becomes clear that nuclear fission and these chain reactions could be possible, these scientists are becoming very concerned that the Nazis might try to harness that new technique to create an atomic weapon. And so three of the most prominent of these émigré scientists, Leo Szilard, Edward Teller, and Eugene Wigner, they were all Hungarian Jewish scientists living in the US. They write a letter to Roosevelt, and they say, well, Germany might be developing this. This is theoretically possible, and that the US and Britain needs to begin its own atomic program. They take the letter to Albert Einstein, who is the world's most prominent scientist at this point. If he signs it, then his influence and signature and clout can get them in the door. So Roosevelt gets this letter signed by Einstein, and he authorizes the creation of an advisory committee on uranium. And so he begins to appropriate federal money for nuclear experiments that are being done at the University of Chicago by another famous European physicist, Enrico Fermi. And this is really where we start to see the origins of the Manhattan Project. Now, it takes a long time before the project is actually established. It doesn't actually get established until 1942, but this is kind of the origin of it. So by 1942, 1943, 44, the U.S. atomic weapons program is underway. We have facilities all over the country making elements that will be used in the atomic bomb, and the U.S. is, sort of at least government officials who are, apprised of this information, who know about the Manhattan Project, they are envisioning the U.S. as a nuclear power. The bomb is really seen by scientists and policymakers as a way to control the post-war course of international affairs. But it still has yet to be developed. It's not necessarily clear that it's actually going to work yet. So in May of 1945, Germany surrenders to the Allies. And even though the suggestion to build the bomb initially had been made by scientists who were afraid that Germany would get there first, now it's clear that Germany had not gotten there first. It's very clear that, Germany, for a whole variety of reasons, never got close to developing an atomic bomb. So Germany surrenders to the Allies in May 1945. And there's still some question at this point. Most of the scientists who had worked on the bomb, they had been working, feverishly for a number of years trying to beat the Germans. Now it's clear that they have beaten the Germans. They didn't need to use the bomb on the Germans. And so what do we do now with this weapon? So scientists who are working on the bomb, they don't agree on how it should be used. A lot of them had started to think about, well, what are the implications of this weapon that is going to be, sort of theoretically more powerful than any other weapon ever devised in human history. It's, going to have enormous implications for international relations, society, everything. And so they're very concerned about this. And a group of scientists in Chicago, they set up a committee known as the Frank Committee, and they issue a report on June 11th on kind of the social and political implications of the bomb. And this is a little over a month before the bomb was scheduled to be actually tested. And they predict that there should be almost limitless destructive power of nuclear weapons, and that it's not clear if the U.S., is going to be able to retain a monopoly on nuclear weapons. They argue, well, the knowledge of how to build these things is already out there. Other countries are going to develop this too. And so they argued that, if we attack Japan, if we make this surprise attack on Japan, this is going to sacrifice all of our goodwill that we've earned in the war. It's going to be seen as horrible. We are going to begin an arms race, and it's going to prevent the possibility of getting any kind of international control on this very, very dangerous weapon. So they recommend instead that the U.S. conduct a demonstration of the bomb for other countries. Basically, we take people out to, some little island somewhere. We say, here's the weapon that we have. This is what it can do. We don't want to use it against you, but we will if we have to. So the Frank Committee issues this report. It basically doesn't go anywhere. It never reaches the highest levels of government. In June 16th, the interim committee of the scientific panel, or the scientific panel on the interim committee. The interim committee was a committee set up in the government of very high-ranking government officials to determine what should be done with the atomic bomb. And they had a scientific panel composed of some of the most eminent nuclear physicists, Enrico Fermi, Arthur Compton, Edward Lawrence, J. Robert Oppenheimer. They come up with recommendations for the bomb's use. And they really can't think of a way to do a demonstration that's going to bring about an end to the war. They said that there was no acceptable alternative to military use. So at this point, the issue of whether the bomb is going to be used as a weapon is now closed. A month later, July 16th, we have the Trinity test. This is the first test of an atomic bomb. It's successful. Then the following day, you're going to read this document for your discussion this week. Leo Szilard and a group of other physicists at the University of Chicago, they get together and they sign this petition to the President of the United States, basically arguing the same thing that the Frank Committee did, that, using this weapon is going to be inadvisable. It's not going to, produce the results that you want. It's going to, sort of create some whole host of consequences for the world after the war. We want to, sort of be very careful in using this. And so eventually this petition does go to the government, but it never, sort of is really recognized or anything. It doesn't have a lot of, it doesn't have a lot of clout or anything. On July 26th, Roosevelt issues the Potsdam Declaration, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute. And then on August 6th and 9th, Hiroshima and Nagasaki are destroyed by atomic bombs. So that's the kind of essential countdown to Hiroshima. So the next issue is, well, should we have shared this information on the atomic bomb with the Soviet Union? And that's a kind of an interesting question. A number of scientists argued that we should share this information with the Soviets, partly to, kind of prevent an arms race from developing. If, sort of all of this information was open and out there, then at least it wouldn't, you wouldn't have kind of this race to try to, get more weapons than the other. And so there were a number of prominent scientists who argued that the U.S. should inform the Soviets about the atomic bomb. In It's not clear, sort of how much influence they had over the president, though. And in 1945, at the Potsdam Conference, Truman, who's now the president, he's taken over after Roosevelt's death, and he's facing a number of crucial issues. He is wondering whether Stalin's going to get into the war against Japan. He's wondering whether that will mean that the Russians are going to control more of the Far East, and that wouldn't be a good thing. Sort of, are we going to be able to, compromise with the Soviet Union on some, crucial issues? And kind of how is he going to measure up against Stalin, sort of this kind of great world leader? He is this, kind of newly minted president. How is he going to, kind of measure up? So Truman, he is on his way to the conference when he hears that the Trinity test has been successful. And so this gives him this kind of new amount of confidence. And it becomes clear during the conference that the Soviet Union getting into the war with Japan was not necessarily going to be in America's best interest. The Soviets seemed to want to extend their influence everywhere, including the Far East. And now the fact that we now had this atomic bomb, it made the Soviet invasion of Japan really unnecessary now. We didn't need the Soviets to come in. We could defeat the Japanese on our own. But Truman's unwilling to explicitly inform the Soviets of the existence of the bomb. And he kind of tells Stalin casually, oh, yeah, we have this new weapon of unusual destructive force. And Stalin responds that he's glad to hear it, and he hopes that the U.S. is going to make good use of it against the Japanese. Now, the Soviets already knew of the American atomic program because they'd been spying on the Manhattan Project for a number of years, and they'd already begun their own atomic weapons development. So just a few hours after the atomic age began, the arms race is already now accelerating. And you start to see this is going to become a major, major issue in the early years of the Cold War. So the end of the war on the American home front obviously is this time of very joyous celebration. You can see that in these photos. Americans are deliriously happy the war is over, and there's a lot that the U.S. had to be happy about. First of all, the Allies had won. We had vanquished Hitler and the Nazis, and the threat that fascism would take over the world is now ended. It's an amazing kind of, victory over, sort of hatred and totalitarianism. It's, we have a lot to be happy about. And America is on top at this point. We were alone among the most powerful nations in the world. We had suffered no major damage from the war. World War II is the deadliest conflict in human history. 60 million people were killed in World War II, but U.S. casualties are a small fraction of that number. Around 418,000 Americans were killed during the war, and most of those were military deaths. By contrast, about 23.5 million Soviets are killed during World War II. That's almost 14% of their total population. American deaths were less than 1% of the total American population. Somewhere between 6 to 8 million Germans died in the war, 2 to 3 million Japanese. So the American, sort of death toll is very, very small compared to the catastrophic numbers, everywhere else in the world. The U.S. is suffering no major damage to its infrastructure during the war because none of the fighting, aside from Pearl Harbor, had been done on American soil. Most of Europe and Asia, by contrast, are physically devastated. But the U.S. had actually benefited economically from the war. It was clearly the leading world power at the end of the war. And as you can see in these photos, Americans are wanting for nothing more than a return to normalcy and prosperity after the war. But the war had changed a lot about American life. And peace does not usher in an era of international harmony, as we're going to see. One of the reasons why we see this is the disturbing reports of what comes out at the end of the war with the Holocaust. Of course, it had been widely known that, at least in the Roosevelt administration, they had learned during the war of the extent of the so-called final solution, but they didn't do anything about it. They could have authorized airstrikes that would have destroyed the concentration camps in Germany and Eastern Europe, but they didn't. And so this is very shocking news to see this coming out in the war. And of course, there was still a lot of anti-Semitism in the U.S., and this contributed to the government's unwillingness to allow more than just a handful of European Jews to seek refuge in the United States. And so you can see the results of that here with the Holocaust. And as we're going to see next time, we have this new Cold War with the Soviet Union that had already begun. And over all of the celebration and the jubilation at the end of the war is looming the shadow of the mushroom cloud. And so there's a lot of anxiety also about what the future is going to hold for America at the end of the war. And some of that we'll get into for next time. So I will see you guys all next week.